Hey guys, and welcome to another video from my 3D base. My name is Chris, and the purpose of this video is to talk a little bit about the NG1, and many thanks to Drag for the video, and I figured maybe I should answer some of the questions he had. And yeah, so let's dive into the NG1. Maybe first we'll talk about the motor setup. So one of the questions is obviously why brushed and not brushless. I think that is very simple to answer. Basically, it's just to keep it simple. For the brushed or for the brushless motor, you will need an ESC, and the ESC needs to be controlled, so you need a whole bunch of electronics. Now, the nice thing about brushless motors is the power density. They have a lot, they have higher power density compared to brushed motors, but which then means that the brushed ones will be somewhat bigger, and this is why also you have the setup here up front. Actually, the motors themselves are not that big. It's more the flywheels. The flywheels, well, for the flywheels I've chosen a somewhat larger diameter because the circumferential speed will increase, and I figured that's a good thing to speed up the darts. So we have actually quite big flywheels. The motors themselves are not that big, so from that perspective it could be much smaller. But the 380 motors, and usually we use the ones from Mabuchi, they have quite some torque. So I figured they can easily deal with the larger diameter of some bigger flywheels. So the reason for choosing a brushed setup is basically simplicity and cost. Well, another thing we need to talk about maybe is the voltage setup. So we do recommend using this with a 2S setup, so between 7 and 8 volts, depending on the state of charge of your battery. Reason being mainly legal. There are rules for everything in Germany, and there's also a rule for kinetic energy. And with the 2S setup and the mass of the dart, we're staying below that kinetic energy limit. Now, from a power point of view, you can increase the voltage. So I think the motors can easily handle 3 to 4S. I've done so, I've tested this. However, this is something I would not recommend then. The flywheels are also optimized for a 2S setup, so if you want to get maximum performance out of a 3S or 4S setup, you would have to also slightly adopt the flywheels to maximize FPS. Now, the flywheels are printed out of PLA, which is actually quite a tough and good thermoplastic with good strength properties. However, you could consider then printing them out of PA, which is somewhat tougher than PLA, or even polycarbonate. I mean, both of those materials could be considered. Yeah, vertical flywheels. Why did I go for vertical flywheels? I like symmetry, and also the motors are quite long, and this is another difference between brushed and brushless motors. The brushed motors obviously need some more volume to achieve the same power and torque, so they're quite long, and I figured it looks nicer if they're arranged horizontally. So I have no intention at the moment to move on to a vertical setup. Well, now about the name, the NG1, obviously that stands for, as Drag mentioned, it's the Nerf gun 1. However, it's not the first iteration. This is the NG1 V2A6, so we went through quite a few iterations, and most changes were actually minor. However, let me just quickly talk about the initial design. So initially I thought I could do a full auto setup with a solenoid. A solenoid is basically a copper coil that moves an iron piston, and I thought this would work to push the dart into the flywheel cage. However, there's a problem with the solenoid. The solenoid does not create a linear force. On the contrary, the force is almost equal to 0 in the beginning, and then it increases the more the pusher rod moves into the coil. This turned out to be not realistic, so the force the solenoid created was inadequate to push the dot. It would have been quite nice because it's a simple setup, but it turned out not to work. So regarding the semi-auto or the automatic setup, I am working on a design that features a full auto setup with a geared motor. The only thing that restricts me from moving on this quicker is basically time. This is what is limiting me at the moment, but it's definitely feasible. It's working, and it's coming up at some point. Right. So that's a little bit about the development, and then mostly the iterations and the changes I had to implement were minor in design, but had quite some effect on performance and reliability. So in the beginning, it was down to even the smallest detail to make sure that darts don't get stuck or spin out of control. This was quite difficult to figure out. So I went through quite a few iterations. Hold on, I can show you quite a few iterations of the flywheels, and I still have a few of them lying around here. So I went through a whole test program for the flywheels, mainly to maximize FPS and to minimize vibration. So I went through quite a few designs of the flywheels to figure out how to print them, what orientation, what infill, what speed, to come up with this version. This is I believe the 7th version of the flywheel. And as I maybe mentioned, I can't remember, but if you want to go for higher voltage, so higher RPM, you would have to adopt or optimize the flywheels for that new setup. So it's definitely been an iterative development. It took me about a year to get to this point where it functions reliable and has a decent performance. Another word about performance maybe, the idea with this is also to be able to improve on it constantly. So performance-wise, it is not hitting a limit at the moment, especially with this setup. So I believe at some point I would definitely want to try out to push it towards 200 FPS or beyond. I'm not even sure if that is feasible, but it's definitely something I want to check out at some point in time. So yeah, I talked about the full auto development. The one I have here is the one I personally use for testing. You can see it has a bunch of other features. It has a voltage indicator. It has a new stock I'm currently working on, because I'm not, one idea is to maybe put the battery, instead of putting it at the side, to put it in the stock itself. So this is always retrofittable, so this stock would go on any NG1, and you could put your battery in it. The same is actually true also for the full auto setup. It is retrofittable. The only major change is to the upper orange part here that houses the full auto mechanism and the dart pusher. So that would have to be changed. So let's see if I've forgotten anything. I made some notes here, but I believe so not. But feel free to comment or add any questions you might have, and I'll try to answer them. And if you feel like following us on Instagram and YouTube, cool. Thank you very much, and all the best, Chris from My 3D Base. Bye.